I'm recording this pretty much entirely in one go. And I'm motivated entirely by, well, myself, my own internals on this one. Um, I think it's hard. Okay, so I'll explain. And this is all ad libbed. I'm sure I'm gonna. I know me. I'm not gonna edit this. Um, The history of Eden Perpetua is deeply tied to the way things used to be, back when the realm was referred to as Yggdrasil. Yes, it was inspired by the world tree from Norse mythology as far as naming goes, but it is far more significant than that in a sense. It's not actually based in Norse mythology, but the original name of the realm was Yggdrasil. In fact, I used to refer to things as the Yggdrasil saga, because the idea was all of reality came from one original point and slowly branched out, and there was a whole series of failsafes involved with that. And there were a few concepts that I labeled as, for lack of a better explanation, core memories. They were events that were used, that they were consistent across all versions of events, and they were used as kind of pivot points for major changes to the realm. Everybody's individual choices made infinitely branching paths, but the biggest, like, chunkiest branches from the main trunk were mostly pivoted around these. And one aspect of that is to the far northwest of the original layout of the world was a I would, for lack of an explanation, I'd call it an Australian kind of continent. Big old chunky land in the middle of the Northwest. It was kept away from the rest of the planet through a very heavy storm across the oceans around it. And by the time technology had advanced enough to reach it through the sky or space, the major events of that continent had played out, and there was only ruins of the people that once lived there, at least to the outside observer. And the root changes that gave birth to in Perpetua, that started the Scarlett Order, all of that is heavily tied to the history of Des which in its natural language that I had made up for it meant land of source. It was the source of all life. It was where all life, as far as the cultures there knew, began, and therefore all life found its source in that continent. I actually wrote a side story set in the same. It's not the same exact setting, but it's the same continent, just shifted a little bit in its in Perpetua iteration. But in the original realm of the Yggdrasil timeline, Des was one of the first ever realms I had ever built, and I found a home for it as I expanded the Yggdrasil realm. So, on the continent of Des they had uncovered lost technology from a previous culture that had been probably meddling more in human cultural development than it should have. That's a story for another time. But in the course of that, they uncovered what they assumed was magic because they were a very medieval society, but it was lost technology, known as the runic networks. They found ways to... The way they defined the language of it all was what verbal sounds they made that had the same effect as carving the runes into things. But the general idea of runic networks was it's like programming the planet. It was the programming language of nature itself. By knowing just the right order and right way to input the data, and then channeling your own life energy into it to power the circuit, you could get reality to do what you wanted. And that's as far as they understood. The fine nuances are basically theoretical physics about atomic level micromanagement of magnetic fields. So it's a whole bunch of shenanigans I'm not going to get into. But it was a lost technology that these medieval peasants discovered in lost ruins and found how to make work for themselves. As this technology was uncovered, various people who either had large storehouses of knowledge about it already that they had recovered in the ruins, or had been instructed before the disappearance of the original civilization, began to form a kind of code around how they were going to deal with it. And there were certain bits of knowledge they purposely kept sealed away or kept lost. And one of those aspects was the ability to control electricity. It was considered highly dangerous. Not only could one channel, say, a lightning bolt instead of their own life energy, just by ionizing the air, the amount of energy they got from the lightning bolt would be far more than what they expended ionizing the air. And it would create all kinds of issues, but there was also other implications. One could, for example, rewire the human mind by controlling the electricity within it, rewiring the synapses. One could manipulate the electricity in a different person's body to energize and power up the cells in their own body, for another example. But it was that knowledge of that rune and the abilities of runic networks on that was deemed too dangerous. But it was also too dangerous to remain completely ignorant of, because somebody was inevitably going to discover it again. And so the monks in the Grand Library of the City of Snow, spelt without a W because I don't know why. I think it looks cool. I'm going to keep it that way. The monks in the Grand Library had a tradition. They referred to them as the Lightning Sage. There would be one person who would be the sole inheritor of the forbidden knowledge. And they would always have one apprentice, just so that way if something were to happen, not all the information would be lost. That way you could never truly lose any of that information in case it became necessary. And the entire idea being that because they had access to exactly how all of these runic networks worked, to an intimate detail passed directly into their brain from their previous mentor, or in the case of a later generation, they would channel all of that knowledge into a quartz crystal. They would use their ability to shape the quartz crystal into a circuit that would preserve that information. And they would keep that on them. And the idea being that should anything happen, or if it became necessary to pass down the title because corruption, etc., the apprentice could always have that information. And the idea being that the Lightning Sage was not only very aware of just how dangerous it was and would have the self-restraint not to abuse their knowledge, but also would swear themselves to a code that they would impose on themselves. They would not get involved in the larger world. They would not try and shape politics. Their role was specifically the mitigation and control over the knowledge of the lightning rune and those who would abuse runic networks to try and take over the world, etc. Because the idea that nature has to keep a balance. For everything brought into the world, inevitably it must be sent back to the soil. It must be sent back to the land or the planet begins to die. And people who have read Full Metal Alchemist, because I haven't, I still haven't as of this, they're like, oh, equivalent exchange. You know what? Fair, but it's just a fact of actual life. You cannot keep something going infinitely without recycling that back into the world. It's a whole thing. It's an actual... People are going to call it the laws of entropy, and that's fair, but that's not really what I'm talking about. Either way, call it the law of equivalent exchange if you please. I don't take it personally. I've heard Full Metal Alchemist is a very well-told story, so I'm not going to take it personally. So the Lightning Sage is sworn to these taboos. And there's a few bits of forbidden knowledge they're not supposed to use, but it's technically possible with runic networks. And if you start breaking these taboos, the Lightning Sage will absolutely visit you and will absolutely have to do something about you. And since they know more than you, and they have access to resources you don't because they've been around for a long time and they know more than you and have a better respected title, the Lightning Sage tends to be able to get done what they need to get done. In fact, it's believed by most runers that they're a wives' tale, a fiction, a fabrication from the Grand Library, because there's no way they would, with the Grand Library being as jealous of forbidden knowledge as they are, there is zero chance they would let somebody that dangerous roam free. Little do they know that the reason they let somebody that dangerous roam free is because they could not. They could not promise the safety of the world if they had kept that secret information completely. Somebody would have found it. They would have been powerless. They wouldn't have had time to train. They wouldn't have somebody who's powerful enough to protect the world. Turned out in the end, that wasn't going to stop the inevitable end of their land. Don't worry too much. Various cultures had found workarounds for the specific form of apocalypse that country was facing. But that highly localized apocalypse drove a small group of adventurers into a different world. One of those adventurers being the Lightning Sage, because they were the only ones with the know-how and knowledge to figure out how to escape their dying continent and find a new home. So you have the Lightning Sage. You have a member of the Beastkin, which is a whole separate thing. We will discuss that culture another time. But short version is they use runic network tattoos to reshape their body to have animal-like qualities. And that was a cultural thing for them, becoming one with the land by becoming things that were one with the land. You had that. You had some lesser members of nobility from the City of Snow. You had some of those that were descendants from the lost nations that left the lost technology, and it was only 4 of them. So you had that, and it seemed like that was all there was going to be, right? You had a bunch of straggling survivors, and I'd say about 200 probably in total, and then you had the four great leaders. The 4 great leaders, thankful simply to be alive, and thankful to the Lightning Sage for saving them. Because the Lightning Sage is one of the 4 great leaders, but that's technicalities here. So you had a descendant of the ancient culture, you had the royal family of Snow, and then you had the leader of the Beastkin. The nobility from Snow, they ended up traveling to the southern end of the continent because the people of Snow, due to having built their lives in one of the fallen cities, that's the City of Snow it's a whole thing. Anyway, having built their lives in a fallen city on the shore, they were rather capable of navigating the seas. So they wanted to investigate this new land. The Lightning Sage decided that they were going to do the best they could to just, find everybody a home, find a new life. Because given that this was not their home, there was no more runic networks to mitigate and control, right? They were finally free of their duty. Their only job was to make sure that the information in their head died with them, because there was no more need for a Lightning Sage. This place didn't seem to have runic networks. Even as they tried using theirs, they didn't seem to work. And she could tell why. She could, if she wanted to, she could adjust, and she did, to provide food and water for everybody. But everybody's current understanding of runic networks just wasn't going to work. It had to be adjusted if it was going to be used, and she wasn't going to volunteer that information. It was technology, but she was sure that this realm would form their own technology, that runic networks were far too dangerous, especially given that those runic networks had triggered the apocalypse of their world. So she, aware of what she was doing, made a decision that she was going to make sure Runic Networks died with her and that everybody was found comfortable finding a space of their own in this new world. The nobility of Snow ended up, while they found a way, they fashioned themselves a means of sea travel, and they explored the world. And they ended up settling on the western continent, which was probably the most inhospitable, but it wasn't going to stop them. You had the southern continent, which was entirely savage, but some of their people would settle there. But that was a continent that was mostly left untouched. Just a few people liked the more temperate climate of it, and so a few of the straggling survivors would find their solace there. The Beastkins would find their home on the eastern continent, living off the mountains and the land, sensing that there had been very little disruption to the natural order of things. That would lead to complications as time went on, but that would be how that would go, is the Beastkin survivors and those who wished to form a culture with them settled on the eastern continent with the people that had already been living there. And the descendants of the original lost civilization, they settled on the northern, colder continent alongside the Lightning Sage, because the champion there didn't believe it was wise to abandon somebody who had just saved their lives. They were bound by honor to protect her. And Violetta, which is her full name, Violetta was the Lightning Sage. And over the countless centuries of seeking peace, quietly visiting people, and trying to die in a measure of peace, she would pass on at least the code she was living by to the descendants of the ancient people, who recognized the burden she was carrying in the first place. They would form their own cabal. And I say cabal because that's what it became, not what it was at first. But it was a kind of pact. This idea that they, out of appreciation and honor, for her saving their lives, they would do all they could to stick by her side and make sure that even when she died, the memory of what she did would not die with her. Time goes on, as it does. And as centuries pass, Violetta decides that she's going to go check on her friends, right? It's been a couple hundred years, so they've probably passed on, and they're probably contently so. But she wants to check on their kids, just to make sure that everything's fine. And as she does, she discovers something that she wasn't expecting. These people are referring to it as the paradox gene, for reasons she doesn't know, but the runic networks that she thought she was free of weren't working. There had been no working runic networks outside of this situation, but an odd phenomenon had begun to happen, where some that were born from those who came from this world with her, some of those who were descendants of the people she had saved, had begun manifesting abilities that could only be explained by runic networks inside their bodies. People were able to produce fire or manipulate the liquid in the air. Sometimes they were able to manipulate the very ability of their body. In the case of the descendants of the Beastkin, what was once tattoos and an ability to change at will was becoming children born with these beast-like qualities, able to adapt to the land they were in, and finding their own unique subculture with that. Each of their animal qualities reflecting a lot of their personality and their upbringing and who they were raised around. And she thought that was interesting, but fine, right? It's not her place anymore. This isn't her home. These were people from where she's from, but they didn't know her. They were born and raised here. So she thought she'd keep an eye on it. Make sure she understood, what was going on. As this began to continue to escalate, because it happened everywhere she left people, and wherever they commingled with the existing population, this would start to manifest. It wasn't a high percentage of the population, but it was enough people for it to become a new part of the culture. And by the time she thought maybe she should step in to do something, It had already been hundreds of years. It was an established part of the world. They had formed their own cultures, their own rules, their own whole structure around it. She didn't feel right stepping into a world that wasn't hers to enforce the laws of a dead society, especially because these beings, these paradox gene wielders, they didn't seem to be disrupting the flow of nature around them because all of it was internal. It was from within their body, natural to their body, and in equilibrium with nature around them. So there was all of her rules, all of the things that she had been taught, told her this was not time for her to step in.